My father raised his glass under the chandelier in our Highland Park dining room and smiled like he was about to bless the room. "Family," he said, his voice warm and practiced. "What would we be without it?" 30 people sat around that table. Real estate partners, investors, 2 city council members, a lifestyle blogger who had once featured my sister's boutiques, my mother's friends from the museum board, my cousin Amelia, quiet at the far end. My sister, Vanessa Collins, sat to my father's right in a silk red dress that matched the Christmas roses running down the center of the table. 14 Vera Lux boutiques, $1 million quarterly projections, magazine covers framed in our hallway. My father turned toward her first. "One daughter runs $1 million fashion chain," he said proudly. 14 locations, national recognition. She built an empire. Applause rippled lightly across the table. Vanessa dipped her chin, pretending humility. Then he looked at me. "And then there's Victoria." He chuckled softly, swirling his wine. "She works in admin. Basically the maid of the corporate world." The laughter came fast, too fast to be accidental. Vanessa laughed the loudest. My mother scanned the table, watching reactions, making sure the joke landed the way she wanted. An investor smirked. One of my father's partners clinked his glass against another. Someone repeated the word "maid" under their breath. I felt the heat climb my neck, not embarrassment, not even anger, just a familiar tightening in my chest. I counted to 3. Then I set my glass down carefully against the white linen tablecloth. "Thank you," I said evenly, my voice steady enough to surprise even me, "for finally saying out loud what you've believed for years." The laughter died mid-breath. Forks paused halfway to mouths. A cough echoed too loudly in the sudden silence. My father blinked, smile still frozen on his face. "Don't be sensitive," he said lightly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't tremble. I simply pushed my chair back. "I'm not," I replied. And then I walked out of the dining room while 30 people sat in absolute silence. Outside, the December air bit through my thin coat. Our front lawn glittered with white lights wrapped around every oak tree. The house looked like something out of a luxury magazine spread. Perfect, controlled, polished. I reached my car before I allowed myself to breathe deeply. I didn't cry. Instead, I replayed his exact wording. Basically, the maid. The phrasing had rhythm. It felt rehearsed, too clean to be spontaneous. My phone buzzed. Amelia. I hesitated before opening the message. "I'm so sorry. They planned that." Planned. The word hit harder than the insult. I slid into the driver's seat but didn't start the engine. I watched the front door of the house from behind my windshield. Through the glass panels, I could see shadows moving. My mother's silhouette, animated again. Vanessa's posture, tall and unbothered. This wasn't new. It was patterned. My father, Richard Collins, built his real estate empire on leverage and visibility. Appear strong, control the narrative, never let uncertainty show. My mother, Eleanor, curated reputation like it was an heirloom. Charity galas, editorial spreads, holiday cards staged like campaign posters. And Vanessa. Vanessa was the crown jewel, 4 years older. Always first. First fashion show in high school. My parents rented out a small event venue and hired photographers. When she opened her first boutique, my father wrote the seed capital check without blinking. When I graduated with a degree in organizational psychology from the University of Texas, my mother hugged me and said, "That's practical." Practical. In our house, practical meant invisible. There are 15 framed photos lining the hallway near the staircase. 13 feature Vanessa, magazine shoots, store openings, ribbon cuttings. I appear once. High school graduation, partially hidden behind a decorative vase. I work in human resources for a mid-sized logistics firm in Dallas. I manage compliance audits. I resolve executive disputes. I design internal accountability systems that prevent companies from collapsing under their own growth. None of it photographs well. None of it glitters under chandeliers. But systems are what keep empires standing. My phone buzzed again. An email notification. Unknown sender. Subject line. Keep her in position. It had landed in my spam folder. I stared at the preview text without opening it. Christmas will remind her. My pulse slowed instead of quickening. I didn't feel humiliated anymore. I felt clear. I drove 3 blocks away and parked in the lot of a closed pharmacy, engine idling softly. The house lights were no longer visible from here. For years, I had tried to win quietly, tried to earn acknowledgement, tried to make them proud in a language they understood. Tonight made something painfully simple. They didn't misunderstand me. They managed me. I opened my email app fully this time. 37 messages in a thread. Senders: Richard Collins, Eleanor Collins, Vanessa Collins. The earliest dated 18 months ago. Subject line: What to do about Victoria. I didn't open them yet. I just stared at the screen, the glow reflecting faintly against the windshield. They hadn't laughed at me by accident. They had organized me. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't thinking about how to defend myself. I was thinking about how long they'd been afraid of me. I woke up on December 26th to silence. No apology text. No missed calls from my parents. No, "Are you okay?" from Vanessa. Just the soft hum of my apartment heater and a pale strip of winter light cutting across my bedroom wall. For a moment, I almost convinced myself I had imagined the toast, that maybe my father's words hadn't landed the way they felt. Then I reached for my phone. My mother had already posted. A perfectly filtered photo of the Christmas table, crystal glasses, gold flatware, the 12-foot tree glowing in the background. Caption: Blessed beyond measure. 37 comments. Fire emojis. Heart emojis. You have such a beautiful family. No sign of me in the photo. I zoomed in slowly. There I was, barely visible in the reflection of a mirror behind the table. Blurred, half obscured by a floral centerpiece, holding a serving tray. I let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Vanessa had posted too. A group photo from the end of the night. My father's arm around her shoulders. My mother glowing beside them. A cluster of investors smiling wide. The left side of the frame had been cropped tighter than necessary. The space where I had been standing was gone. Invisible again. I lay back against my pillow and stared at the ceiling. The Collins family hierarchy was simple. Richard Collins built high-rise condominiums and luxury retail spaces across Dallas. He believed money measured worth. If it generated revenue, it mattered. If it didn't, it was decorative. My mother, Eleanor, curated reputation the way other women curated heirloom jewelry. She understood the unspoken currency of social positioning, who to invite, who to ignore, who to spotlight. And Vanessa. Vanessa was the empire. 4 years older than me. Smarter, sharper, more ambitious. Founder and CEO of Vera Lux, 14 boutiques across Texas and Colorado. Quarterly revenue that made my father beam at charity auctions. When people asked my mother how many children she had, she often answered, "I have a daughter who runs a fashion empire." Technically, it wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. There are 15 framed photographs lining the hallway of our Highland Park home. 13 feature Vanessa, her first boutique opening, her second boutique ribbon cutting, her cover in a regional fashion magazine, her and my father breaking ground on a new mixed-use retail development. I appear once, high school graduation, standing between my parents, smiling too wide, partially hidden behind a tall ceramic vase. Growing up, the comparisons weren't loud. They were precise. When Vanessa hosted her first high school fashion showcase, my parents rented a small venue and hired a photographer. When I won a regional debate competition, my father shook my hand and said, "Good job, that'll look nice on applications." When Vanessa moved to New York for fashion school, my parents paid her rent for the first year. When I went to Austin to study organizational psychology, I took out student loans and worked part-time in the campus administration office. Vanessa was celebrated. I was practical. Practical meant safe. Practical meant useful. Practical meant invisible. I work in human resources. At least, that's how I summarize it when someone at a cocktail party asks what I do. In reality, I design internal systems that prevent companies from imploding. I structure reporting lines. I draft compliance frameworks. I mediate executive disputes before they become lawsuits. I build the bones. You don't see bones unless something breaks. That morning, as I scrolled through LinkedIn, I noticed a post from Vera Lux. Optimized internal structure for scalable growth. The caption read, Leadership alignment and operational excellence. Vanessa stood in front of a whiteboard in the photo, arms crossed, confident smile in place. I recognized the workflow chart behind her. I had designed it. My phone buzzed. A name I hadn't expected. Thomas Hale. He didn't text. He had simply liked a recent internal Axis consulting post, one announcing a successful restructuring project in Austin. I stared at the notification longer than necessary. Thomas Hale wasn't just an investor. He was one of the men sitting 3 seats down from my father last night, the same man who had been studying me when I walked out. 2 years ago, during a Vera Lux investor dinner at the Dallas Country Club, he had asked a question Vanessa couldn't answer. How does your internal compliance scale across 14 locations? Vanessa had smiled, deflected. I had answered, briefly, precisely. He had looked at me differently after that. Have you considered stepping into executive operations? He had asked. Vanessa had cut in before I could respond. She prefers staying behind the scenes. Behind the scenes. I sat up in bed and let that phrase settle in my chest. Behind the scenes didn't mean powerless. It meant structural. It meant foundational. It meant that if I stepped away, the surface would crack. My email notification blinked again. The spam folder. I opened it this time, not fully diving in, just scanning subject lines. Keep her in position. Don't let her overshadow. Christmas strategy. The timestamps were close together. Late November. 3 days before Christmas Eve. One preview line caught my breath. After this dinner, she'll understand her place. I closed the app slowly. I could confront them. Call my father. Demand explanation. Send screenshots to the extended family group chat. Expose everything. Instead, I drafted a message to my mother. I'm disappointed in you. I stared at the sentence for 10 seconds. Then I deleted it. This wasn't about disappointment. This was about architecture. For years, I had been trying to prove that I belonged at their table. Maybe the problem wasn't the table. Maybe it was the fact that I kept asking for a seat. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up. For the first time in my life, I wasn't thinking about how to correct their perception of me. I was thinking about how long they had been deliberately shaping it, and more importantly, what I would do now that I knew. The first time I learned my place wasn't at Christmas. It was inside my sister's empire. Vanessa had called me in early 2022, her voice softer than usual. I need help, she had said, and I can't trust anyone outside the family. Vera Lux was expanding fast. 8 boutiques had turned into 14 in less than 18 months. Investors were circling. Press coverage was increasing. And behind the polished storefront windows, the internal structure was cracking. High turnover, managers threatening to quit, payroll inconsistencies, a compliance warning from the Texas Workforce Commission that could have triggered fines large enough to spook funding. You're good at the back-end stuff, Vanessa had added. The boring operational details. I need someone I can trust to fix it. I heard what I wanted to hear. Trust, validation, an opening. I agreed without negotiating compensation. She said it would be temporary, discreet, cleaner without a formal title. Let's keep it internal, she said. Less confusion. For 8 months, I worked 2 jobs. Corporate HR during the day, Vera Lux at night. I rewrote hiring protocols from scratch, standardized employment contracts across all 14 locations, built a reporting chain that didn't rely on Vanessa approving every decision personally, implemented a performance review framework that gave store managers measurable accountability. I handled a harassment complaint quietly before it escalated to litigation. I corrected payroll misclassifications that would have cost the company hundreds of thousands in back taxes and penalties. I never asked for public acknowledgement. I believed competence would be enough. One evening, at a regional manager retreat, a store director pulled me aside. "You're the real backbone here," she whispered. "We all know it." I smiled and said nothing. A few weeks later, Vanessa invited me to attend an investor dinner at the Dallas Country Club. "Just in case operational questions come up," she said casually. Thomas Hale was there that night. The dining room was dim and expensive, the kind of space where quiet conversations moved markets. Vanessa presented expansion strategy, brand growth, customer loyalty metrics, influencer partnerships. Then Thomas leaned forward. "How are you managing compliance across 14 locations with such rapid growth?" Vanessa hesitated. Her eyes flicked toward me. I answered. Concise, structured, controlled. I explained our internal audit cycle, our compliance checkpoints, the escalation system I had designed to flag risk before it reached executive level. Thomas listened closely. When I finished, he turned slightly in his chair. "Have you considered stepping into executive operations?" he asked me directly. The question hung in the air longer than it should have. Vanessa's smile tightened. "She prefers staying behind the scenes," she said smoothly. "Victoria thrives in support roles." Support roles. Thomas didn't argue, but he didn't look convinced either. Later that night, Vanessa cornered me near the coat check. "You don't need to answer every question," she said quietly. "You're there to assist, not to present." "I was clarifying," I replied. She stepped closer. "Don't overstep." That was the first crack. The second came 6 weeks later. The systems were complete, compliance stabilized, turnover down, investor confidence rising. Vanessa scheduled a private meeting at headquarters. Her tone was calm, polished, almost rehearsed. "We're restructuring leadership alignment," she began, "and I think it's best if we go in a different direction." Different direction. "You mean I'm done?" I asked. "I think the cultural vision of the brand doesn't align with your approach," she said. "Cultural misalignment, 8 months, unpaid nights, crisis management, infrastructure built from nothing, and I was culturally misaligned." My badge access was deactivated that afternoon. No announcement, no acknowledgement. 3 days later, Vanessa posted on LinkedIn, "Streamlining leadership team to support visionary growth." Visionary. I told my parents that evening. My father listened without interrupting. "Well," he finally said, "Vanessa knows how to run her company." My mother folded her hands neatly. "There must have been tension," she added. "You can be intense." Intense. Not strategic, not competent. Intense. I didn't argue. I didn't mention the investor dinner, or Thomas's question, or the warning look Vanessa had given me. I let the silence settle. Months later, I would discover an email thread dated shortly after that dinner. Subject line: "We need to be careful with Victoria." The first message was from my father. "She impressed Hale," he had written. "That complicates optics." Vanessa had replied within minutes. "She's good at building systems. That doesn't mean she belongs at the table." My mother had added, "Make sure she understands she works for the family, not beside it." Works for, not beside. I sat at my kitchen table on December 26th and scrolled through those words again. They hadn't misjudged me. They had measured me. They saw exactly what I was capable of, and they adjusted accordingly. The removal wasn't about incompetence, it was containment. They weren't afraid I would fail. They were afraid I would be seen. I closed my laptop slowly and leaned back in my chair. Christmas hadn't been a joke. It had been reinforcement, a reminder of hierarchy. But something had shifted, because this time, instead of shrinking, I felt something else rising. I hadn't been fired from the empire. I had been removed from it, and without realizing it, they had just set me free. I didn't look for another job after Vanessa removed me from hers. For the first few weeks, I told myself I was just resting, recovering, letting the humiliation settle into something manageable. But the truth was simpler. I was done asking to be hired. I sat at the small kitchen table in my uptown apartment with a legal pad and wrote one sentence across the top. What do companies collapse from? The answer wasn't branding. It wasn't product. It wasn't even funding. They collapsed from internal fractures, misaligned leadership, poor compliance, unchecked ego. I had spent 8 months quietly holding my sister's empire together, and I realized something that felt almost dangerous. I was very good at it. Instead of sending out resumes, I registered a domain name, internalaxisconsulting.com. It sounded clinical, structural, not glamorous. Perfect. I built the website myself. Late nights, YouTube tutorials open in one tab, design templates in another. I wrote my own service descriptions, executive HR architecture, crisis restructuring, compliance repair, leadership alignment systems. There were no investors backing me, no family capital, no press releases. Just me, a laptop, and the understanding that structure determined survival. My first outreach emails were awkward, direct, honest. If your company is growing faster than your systems can sustain, I can fix that. Most of them went unanswered. One didn't. A mid-sized retail chain in Austin was facing a quiet disaster. Internal complaints about management practices had begun surfacing online. A former employee threatened legal action. Store managers were resigning faster than replacements could be trained. The CEO called me on a Tuesday afternoon. I was referred by someone who said you rebuild systems without burning the house down, he said. I prefer to reinforce foundations, I replied. We negotiated a short-term contract. Nothing life-changing, but enough. I drove to Austin every Monday for 3 months. I walked into a company that felt tense, defensive, fragile. Payroll classifications were inconsistent. Managers were improvising policies. There was no unified reporting structure. It was familiar. I rebuilt their internal framework from scratch, documented accountability lines, replaced 2 senior managers who were poisoning morale, implemented a compliance calendar with hard deadlines. When I uncovered misclassified labor contracts that could have cost them millions in back pay penalties, the CEO went quiet for a long time. You just saved us, he said finally. I didn't smile. I stabilized you, I corrected. 6 months later, turnover had dropped significantly. The legal threat dissolved. Investor confidence returned. At a board meeting, the CEO publicly credited Internal Axis Consulting for preventing structural implosion. It was the first time my name was associated with something visible that had nothing to do with my family. He introduced me to a small private investment group in Dallas. That group introduced me to 2 more clients. By the end of that year, Internal Axis had 9 contracts across Texas, 17 consultants working under my framework. Revenue passed $3.2 million annually. I didn't post about it. I didn't issue press statements. I declined 2 podcast invitations. Vanessa thrived in spotlight. I thrived in leverage. One afternoon, while reviewing new client portfolios, I noticed something that made me pause. One of my consulting contracts was indirectly connected to a logistics supplier that serviced Verilux distribution centers. It took me a minute to fully register the irony. My systems were now strengthening companies that stabilized parts of my sister's supply chain. She didn't know. She didn't need to. power didn't always announce itself. Around that same time, I noticed Thomas Hale's firm listed among the investment groups that had interacted with one of my clients. He hadn't contacted me directly, but the proximity was undeniable. A few weeks later, one of my consultants flagged something in an industry report. Vera Lux had quietly restructured its internal HR policies. Poorly. They had removed several accountability layers I originally implemented. Employee turnover was creeping up again. Store managers were reporting confusion about reporting chains. It wasn't a collapse. Not yet. But it was a crack. I leaned back in my office chair and studied the numbers. My father once told me that leadership was about dominance. Vanessa believed leadership was about visibility. I was beginning to understand something else entirely. Leadership was architecture. You didn't need to be seen to hold weight. You just needed to understand where the pressure points were. Back in my apartment on the night after Christmas, I reopened my financial dashboard. Quarterly projections exceeded expectations. Expansion into Houston was not just possible, it was inevitable. My phone buzzed with a new email notification, Texas Business Council. I opened it slowly. Subject: Nomination Confirmation, Business Transformation Leader Award. I read it once, then again. Selected nominee, recognition of structural innovation. 800 industry leaders expected to attend. Media coverage confirmed. Event location: Four Seasons, Dallas. Sponsor list attached. I scrolled. Platinum sponsor, Vera Lux. I sat very still. The ballroom that would hold 800 people. The stage with professional lighting. The sponsor banners hanging behind the podium. Vanessa's logo. My father in a tuxedo. My mother smiling for cameras. They had built a house of visibility. And I had built something that could not be cropped out of a photograph. I closed my laptop and let the silence settle around me. For years, I had been the daughter in the background, the one holding the tray, the one adjusting the details, the one ensuring the system didn't fail. Now, I had been invited into a room where visibility mattered, and this time, I wouldn't be standing behind anyone. I would be walking onto the stage, and they wouldn't see it coming. I opened the email thread just after midnight. The subject line was sterile. Managing optics. 37 messages stretched across 18 months. My father's name. My mother's. Vanessa's. The first email was dated 2 days after that investor dinner at the country club. Richard Collins had written it. "She impressed Hale," he began. "That complicates optics." Complicates optics. He didn't say I impressed him, or that he was proud. He described me like a variable that needed adjustment. Vanessa had replied within 12 minutes. "She doesn't understand executive visibility," she wrote. "She thrives in structure, not leadership." My mother responded shortly after. "Let's make sure she doesn't confuse competence with authority." I leaned back in my chair and felt something cold settle into place. They had seen exactly what I was capable of, and they had discussed how to contain it. I scrolled. A week later, another email from my father. "Every family has roles. Vanessa is the face. Victoria must remain operational." Must remain. Operational. As if I were an asset to be allocated. Vanessa replied, "I'll handle it. If necessary, I'll remove her officially." The timestamp was 2 months before I was let go from Vera Lux. I continued scrolling. There it was. Subject line: Leadership realignment. Vanessa writing to my parents 3 days before my termination meeting. "She's becoming visible to investors. That shifts internal dynamics." My father responded within minutes. "Remove her before the funding round. Better to reposition now than allow confusion." My mother chimed in. "Frame it as culture fit." Culture fit. I remembered sitting across from Vanessa in her glass-walled office while she delivered those exact words to my face. Cultural misalignment. It hadn't been about fit. It had been about fear. I kept scrolling. There were smaller emails, too. Vanessa complaining that store managers were deferring to Victoria. My father warning, Don't let her mistake structure for strategy. My mother suggesting that I was intense and might resent hierarchy. Then the thread jumped forward to late November. Subject line, holiday messaging. I stopped breathing for a moment. Vanessa had written first. She's building something quietly. I don't like that she's gaining independent traction. Independent traction. That was what threatened them. Not failure. Independence. My father replied. Then we remind her publicly where she stands. My mother hesitated. Be careful. It must look light-hearted. Vanessa's response came 3 days before Christmas. I have the toast ready. After that dinner, she won't forget her place. I stared at that sentence until the words blurred. The humiliation wasn't impulsive. It wasn't a poorly timed joke. It was a strategy. I scrolled further down and found something I hadn't expected. An email forwarded accidentally from Vanessa's assistant. It included a brief mention of Thomas Hale reviewing Internal Axis Consulting's portfolio for a possible restructuring project. Vanessa had responded quickly. Keep that quiet. If she gains public recognition, it complicates family positioning. Family positioning. My father's reply was shorter. If she ever stands in a spotlight, it won't be because of us. I closed my eyes. They weren't blind to my progress. They were tracking it, monitoring it, adjusting for it. Christmas had been preemptive damage control. They wanted to shrink me before someone else elevated me. For a few minutes, I let the anger surface. I imagined forwarding the entire thread to extended family, printing copies and handing them out at the next holiday dinner, posting screenshots online, letting their careful image fracture under the weight of their own words. I opened a new email window, attached the thread, addressed it to my parents, typed one line. You underestimated the wrong daughter. I stared at it. Then I deleted it. Exposing them would prove I was hurt, but I wasn't hurt anymore. I was informed. There was a difference. My phone buzzed again. Texas Business Council. Confirmation. Award program finalized. Media coverage confirmed. Nominee briefing attached. Sponsor list enclosed. I opened the attachment. 4 Seasons Dallas. 800 guests expected. Platinum sponsor, Vera Lux. I scrolled to seating assignments. Table 12. Richard Collins, Eleanor Collins, Vanessa Collins. Front third of the ballroom. Close enough to the stage to be visible on camera. I exhaled slowly. They had designed a stage at Christmas to reduce me. Now I had been invited onto a stage they couldn't control. I reopened the email thread one last time. Read the line again. After that dinner, she won't forget her place. I smiled faintly. They were right about one thing. I wouldn't forget, but not for the reason they thought. I archived the thread in a folder labeled Evidence, not for revenge, for clarity. For years, I had believed I was the overlooked daughter, the invisible one, the practical one. Now I understood something far more powerful. They hadn't ignored me. They had managed me, and management only happens when something matters. I closed my laptop and stood up. 2 weeks, 800 people, 1 stage. They had spent 18 months ensuring I remained behind the scenes. Now they were about to sit in front of one. The ballroom lights were warmer than I expected. Golden, expensive, intentional. I stood backstage at the 4 Seasons Dallas with my hands folded loosely in front of me, listening to the murmur of 800 voices filtering through the velvet curtain. Victoria Collins. The name felt different here. Not someone's sister, not someone's daughter, just mine. A coordinator clipped a microphone to my dress and whispered, 2 minutes. I nodded. Through a narrow opening in the curtain, I could see table 12. My father sat upright in a tailored tuxedo, posture rigid, scanning the room like he owned it. My mother leaned toward Vanessa, adjusting something near her shoulder, probably offering commentary about the seating arrangement. Vanessa looked immaculate. Emerald silk, diamond earrings. Her brand logo displayed on the sponsor board behind the stage. She was smiling the way she did at charity galas. Confident, unbothered. They had no idea. The host stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice amplified and smooth. "Tonight we honor leadership that transforms from the inside out." Polite applause. The program had already recognized 3 other award recipients: industry growth, innovation, philanthropy. Now it was time for the Business Transformation Leader Award. A large screen illuminated behind the podium. A short video began playing. Clips of company offices, consultants in meetings, whiteboards filled with structural diagrams. Then my voice, recorded during a brief interview weeks earlier. Systems determine survival. The camera panned over a consulting session I'd led in Austin. My back to the camera, my hands outlining a reporting structure. I saw Vanessa's posture shift slightly at the table. Recognition. The host continued. This year's recipient founded a firm dedicated to internal architecture. In less than 3 years, she has stabilized 9 corporations across Texas, rebuilt executive compliance frameworks, and created sustainable growth systems where others saw collapse. A ripple of impressed murmurs moved through the room. Her company, Internal Access Consulting, has generated more than $3 million annually and employs 17 specialists across the state. My father leaned forward. The host smiled. Please join me in welcoming founder and CEO, Victoria Collins. There are moments when time compresses, when sound dulls and sharpens at the same time. I stepped into the light. For a second, the applause hadn't fully formed. There was a fraction of hesitation in the room. Then it swelled. Louder, stronger, 800 people rising, except for 4. At table 12, my family remained seated. My mother's hand was frozen mid-air, fingers lightly touching her necklace. Vanessa's expression was perfectly controlled, but pale. My father didn't clap. He stared. I reached the podium and adjusted the microphone. The applause continued for several seconds before settling. "Good evening," I began. My voice didn't shake. "I want to start with a story." The room quieted. 3 years ago, I was removed from a leadership role I helped build. I was told I wasn't the right cultural fit, that I worked best behind the scenes. A subtle shift rippled through the audience. Behind the scenes is where structures live. It's where accountability is enforced. It's where leadership either stands or collapses. I let that sentence breathe. There are people who believe visibility defines authority, that if you are not the face of something, you must not matter. My eyes found table 12. My father's jaw tightened. Vanessa's shoulders squared. "But I learned something," I continued. "You can stand behind the curtain and still hold up the entire stage." Silence. Complete. Internal Access Consulting was born out of that understanding. We don't chase headlines. We rebuild foundations. We protect companies from imploding under their own success. A few heads nodded in the audience. Some of the people who doubted me are in this room tonight. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point. I want to thank them. A collective inhale. They taught me something invaluable, that if you are underestimated long enough, you stop seeking validation and start building leverage. Applause began softly. I continued. Leadership is not dominance. It's architecture. It's the quiet reinforcement of systems that allow others to thrive. I paused. And sometimes, the person you label as support is the one ensuring your survival. Vanessa's hand tightened around her champagne glass. My mother looked down. My father's expression didn't move. This award is not revenge, I said. It's recognition, not of visibility, but of impact. I let the final words settle. For anyone in this room who has been told they belong in the background, remember this. Structures outlast spotlights. The applause rose again, this time louder, sustained, 800 people on their feet, except 4. I stepped back from the microphone and accepted the crystal award from the host. Cameras flashed. The sponsor banner behind me displayed Vera Lux in elegant lettering, Vanessa's brand, my stage. As I exited toward the side of the ballroom, I saw Thomas Hale standing near the aisle. He extended his hand. "I knew you were operating at a different level," he said quietly. "I operate where it matters," I replied. Across the room, my father finally stood, not to clap, but to move, toward me. And for the first time in my life, he wasn't walking toward a daughter he underestimated. He was walking toward someone he could no longer contain. My father found me near the service corridor behind the ballroom. The applause was still echoing faintly through the walls, muffled by thick carpeting and closed doors. "Victoria," he said. He didn't say sweetheart. He didn't say honey. Just my name. I turned slowly. Up close, I could see the strain around his eyes. Not anger. Not exactly. Calculation. "You could have told us," he said quietly. "We wouldn't have been blindsided." I held the crystal award loosely at my side. "Would you have listened?" I asked. His jaw tightened. "That's not the point." "It is the point." A catering staff member passed between us, pretending not to hear. My father lowered his voice further. "You embarrassed your sister." I almost smiled. "No," I said evenly. "I stopped protecting her." He inhaled sharply. "You're making this adversarial." "It already was." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then my mother appeared at the end of the corridor. Her mascara had smudged slightly beneath her eyes. She looked smaller without the spotlight. "Victoria," she said softly. There was something different in her tone. Not authority, uncertainty. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. I studied her face carefully. "You never asked." She blinked. "We would have supported you." The word support landed hollow. "When I was removed from Vera Lux," I said calmly. "Did you ask why?" She hesitated. "You and Vanessa work differently," she replied. "Did you ask why?" I repeated. Silence. Behind her, Vanessa finally emerged. Her posture was perfect, controlled, but her eyes were sharp. "You did that intentionally," she said. "Did what?" "Called us out without naming us." I spoke about leadership. "You implied we suppressed you." I held her gaze. "You wrote that I shouldn't stand beside you." Her expression flickered, so she knew I had seen the emails. "I was protecting the brand," she said. "From me?" "From confusion," she snapped. "Investors don't respond well to divided authority." "Authority," I echoed softly. She stepped closer. "You were becoming visible in spaces that weren't yours." There it was, the truth without polish. "Spaces that weren't mine," I repeated. "You build systems," she said, voice tight. "You don't lead public narratives." "I lead outcomes." "That's not the same thing." "It is," I replied calmly. "You just prefer the version with cameras." My father exhaled sharply. "This isn't productive." "It doesn't need to be," I said. My mother's voice trembled slightly. "We are still family." I looked at her carefully. "Family doesn't mean containment." Vanessa's shoulders stiffened. "You think this is victory?" she asked quietly. "No." "Then what is it?" "Clarity." The word hung in the corridor. My father shifted his weight. "You could have destroyed us," he said. "Those emails." I didn't deny it. "But I didn't," I replied. Vanessa folded her arms. "So what now?" It was a challenge disguised as curiosity. "Now?" I said softly. "Nothing changes." That's not possible, she said. It is. I adjusted my grip on the award. I'm not exposing you. I'm not attacking your brand. I'm not competing for your investors. Then why stand on that stage and say those things? Because they were true. Silence settled between us again. The hum of the ballroom grew louder as another set of doors opened down the hall. My father studied me differently now, not dismissively, not indulgently, assessing. You've changed, he said finally. No, I replied. I stopped shrinking. My mother's eyes filled with tears. Can we fix this? I didn't answer immediately. Fix what? I asked instead. Our dynamic. Our dynamic wasn't broken, I said gently. It was intentional. Vanessa's jaw tightened. You're being dramatic. No, I said calmly. I'm being done. The word surprised even me in its steadiness. Done chasing, done explaining, done asking to stand beside someone who insisted I remain behind. My father looked toward the ballroom doors. You're still my daughter. I know. And you still belong at our table. I considered that. For years, I said quietly. I believed that. And now? No, I don't need it. The difference landed heavier than any accusation. Vanessa's voice softened slightly. You're not better than me. I never said I was. Then what are you saying? I'm equal, I replied. That word changed the air. Equal. My father looked like he wanted to argue. My mother looked like she wanted to apologize. Vanessa looked like she wanted to win. I simply stood still. I'm not angry, I added. I'm just not available for the role you assigned me. The ballroom doors opened wider. Thomas Hale was approaching from across the room. Media staff with cameras followed behind him. My father noticed. So that's it? He asked. For tonight, I said. Vanessa studied me one last time. This won't be the last time we share a room. I know. And next time? I met her gaze fully. I won't be behind you. Then I turned and walked back toward the light. Not because I needed it, but because it no longer intimidated me. I didn't go home with them that night. I stayed at the reception. I shook hands. I exchanged cards. I listened to founders describe quiet implosions inside glossy companies. I scheduled meetings for January. Thomas Hale introduced me to 2 private equity partners who were expanding into Houston. You understand pressure points, one of them said. I understand leverage, I replied. Across the ballroom, I saw my family leave together. No one looked back. I didn't expect them to. 3 days later, my mother called. I let it ring twice before answering. Victoria, she said, her voice softer than usual. We need to talk. We already did, I replied gently. That was public. This doesn't have to be. Silence. I didn't realize, she said finally, how deliberate it looked. It was deliberate, I answered. Another pause. We were trying to protect the hierarchy, she said. There it is, I said quietly. She exhaled. Vanessa felt threatened. By me building something independently? She felt blindsided. So did I. That landed. My mother's voice trembled slightly. I never wanted you to feel less. You didn't have to want it, I said calmly. You just had to allow it. We spoke for 12 minutes. No yelling, no accusations, just truth laid bare. When the call ended, I didn't feel closure. I felt space. Vanessa didn't call. Instead, she sent a single text. You changed the dynamic. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. No, I stopped accepting it. She didn't respond. By mid-January, Internal Axis Consulting signed 2 new contracts, one in Houston, one in Denver. Expansion required hiring 5 additional consultants. I interviewed candidates carefully. I looked for clarity, not charisma. One afternoon, a consultant candidate asked me something unexpected. What made you start this firm? I considered my answer. Containment, I said. He looked confused. When someone tries to limit you, I added, you either shrink or you build something that can't be limited. He nodded slowly. I hired him. Meanwhile, industry reports began circulating about Vera Lux. Internal turnover had increased. 2 regional managers had resigned within the same quarter. An anonymous employee review referenced unstable leadership alignment. I didn't smile when I read it. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt validated. Systems don't collapse overnight. They erode quietly. My father called in early February. I want to invest in your expansion, he said, straight to business. I don't need capital, I replied. It's not about money, he insisted. It's about being involved. In what? I asked. In your growth. I leaned back in my office chair and looked out at the Dallas skyline. For years, I said calmly, involvement meant oversight. That's not fair. It's accurate. He was quiet. I miscalculated, he said finally. That word surprised me more than an apology would have. You did, I agreed. And now? Now I don't require correction. He let out a slow breath. You've become formidable. I smiled faintly. I always was. After that, we spoke less frequently. But when we did, the tone was different. No more directives, no more positioning, just conversation. Vanessa and I crossed paths at a private investor event in March. She approached first. Congratulations, she said. Thank you. There was no sarcasm, no competition, just tension held carefully in place. You were right, she admitted quietly, about systems. I know. She gave a short laugh. Still infuriating. I'm not competing with you, I said. You never were, she replied, almost to herself. That was the closest she had ever come to acknowledging it. I didn't expose the emails. I didn't post screenshots. I didn't retaliate. Revenge would have been loud. Freedom was quieter. I stopped attending performative holiday dinners. I declined 2 gala invitations where I would have been seated behind Vanessa. I no longer adjusted myself to fit someone else's hierarchy. And something unexpected happened. When I stopped chasing recognition, people sought me out for it. A journalist from a regional business magazine interviewed me about internal leadership reform. A panel invitation followed, then another. My mother shared one of those articles on her social media. Caption, proud of both my daughters. Both. I noticed. I didn't comment. 1 year after that Christmas dinner, I stood in my own office overlooking downtown Dallas. 23 consultants now worked under internal access. Revenue projections exceeded $5 million. The Crystal Award sat on a shelf behind my desk. Not centered, not spotlighted, just present. My phone buzzed. A text from Vanessa. Dinner next week? Just us. I stared at it. For a moment, I thought about the chandelier, the laughter, the word Maid. Then I thought about the stage, the applause, the silence at table 12. I replied, yes. Not because I needed it. Not because I wanted reconciliation for validation, but because I could choose it without shrinking. That was the difference. The Christmas toast was never about humiliation. It was about control, and control only works when you still believe you need permission. I don't. That night in the ballroom, they finally saw me. But the truth is, I had already seen myself long before the spotlight ever hit. If you've ever been labeled the quiet one, the background one, the one who just works in admin, I want you to know something. Structure outlasts spectacle. Power doesn't have to shout. And sometimes the greatest revenge isn't exposure, it's elevation. If this story felt familiar, tell me. Have you ever been underestimated by your own family? What would you have done in my place? And if you want more stories about boundaries, family dynamics, and building something no one can contain, stay with me. There's more to come. I'm not the maid. I never was.